Yeah, I'm Mariane Ferme, and I teach anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. Yeah, I have been working in Sierra Leone since the mid-1980s. So in the course of all this time, I've actually changed my focus to different things. But I started out with an interest in gender and kind of the everyday politics of gender relations, which is a topic I've just returned to more recently through my work on the Special Court for Sierra Leone and gender crimes in that court. Well, in my original first research project was prompted very much by kind of feminist sympathies for the status of women. And one of the things that I discovered in my work in rural southeastern Sierra Leone was that one of the things that empowered women in this area who unusually, even in the country and the rest of the country, had access to the chiefship and to political, public, strong positions, was not just this secret women's societies which had been written about in the literature for about 2 centuries, that cross-cuts ethnic affiliations in this region and bands together women, and therefore gives them leverage and support for each other when they have social and political aspirations. But also kind of a very daily kind of institutions that not much had been written about, which is the big house in Mende-speaking villages, where all the women of a compound live together. And through the big house and all the economic activities that happen in the big house, women really forged powerful alliances that helped support each other, even in marital disputes, domestic kind of conflicts, including co-wives in polygamous marriages. And so I remember this was a very interesting point. I was interviewed by the media several times after I came back and was writing my dissertation, BBC, French radio, because they thought, are you actually saying that polygamy can actually be advantageous to women? And basically my experience was that in some cases it could. And through the institution of the big house, co-wives could actually support each other in claims towards their husband. Now, this was by no means always the case, but it could have been. So that was one of the surprising findings, is the kind of counterintuitive things in an institution like polygamy that you would not normally think is one that is very kind to women. So having said that, one of the things that also surprised me is the use that was made of that earlier work of mine when the war broke out by Human Rights Watch, by legal scholars who wanted to read up on the customary marriage situation in the country, which was sort of contrary to the way in which the spirit in which I had written some of that work. And that got me interested in the ways in which culture enters the Special Court for Sierra Leone and institutions of humanitarian law more generally, and these international war crimes tribunals. Well, that's one of the issues that I actually examine. I mean, language does matter in my view, and the fact that forced marriage actually first appears in the literature in enormous frequency around 1800 in European debates over typically actually sort of British and French observers and American observers of French institutions, and the ways in which in France, supposedly, forced marriages force women later on into adultery and therefore have a destabilizing influence on society and on morals. I was surprised because, in fact, it's sort of the opposite view from what in pre-war Sierra Leone was the case, which was that an unmarried woman was considered destabilizing to society, and therefore, in rural villages, routinely, women couldn't go more than 1 year after they had reached puberty without showing a husband, as the language said. This included older women, widows who survived their husbands, and so on. So it was considered critical in societies as rural subsistence societies were in which all kinds of very complex plays of interdependence rather than individual autonomy were actually critical to stability, that women be attached to men. So in pre-war society, women couldn't be said to be free to marry or not marry anyway. So what the norm was forced marriage. Certainly in the way early Europeans understood forced marriage, which was arranged marriage, essentially. And so the notion that then, what I found paradoxical is that calling it a crime in the Special Court for Sierra Leone, as happened, allowed women to speak of sexual violence, including within marital relations there, in a way that completely silenced the experience of rape and domestic violence outside of the war context, either before or after, or even concurrent with the war, but with legitimate husbands who were nonetheless, having sexual relations with him against their will. So anthropologists have noticed this in other cases as well. So, for instance, Veena Das, who worked on the violence of partition in India in 1947, noted that in recollections collected much later, women who felt comfortable talking about rape they'd suffered at that point in time did not feel comfortable talking about abusive husbands who raped them, and so on. So what I found interesting was the ways in which naming it in a certain arena actually makes it impossible to speak of it in other arenas. So even though some legal scholars and feminist activists feel confident that the international criminal processes surrounding forced marriage will eventually have a trickle-down effect and reform national bodies of law and make rape more, sort of heinous as a crime, even within marriage, within those countries. I don't see that happening, certainly not in Sierra Leone, given my experience.